Hey everybody, welcome to On the Clock with Caroline Clark. I'm so excited today because this is a subject that, I've really been wrestling with all these many months, and I expect many of you have too. Our guest today is Stephanie Bryant, and there's an old expression. My mother used to say this: there's time enough to do everything, but don't do everything at the same time. And Stephanie has kind of found herself in a place in the midst of this pandemic where she's made an enormous number of life-changing decisions or faced just life-changing events in the midst of this very uncertain time. So Stephanie, thank you for taking the time to come on with me today. So good to see you.
So good to see you. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to have the chance to have this conversation with you.
Well, I'm excited to have this conversation because I think that, we're all struggling in our own way with these days and the sort of hovering sense of uncertainty around everything, job prospects and children and, meeting someone to form a life with, or figuring out how to extend your life with the someone you already have, or, big life-changing events. I've been on more big Zoom birthday parties than, probably any of the birthday people care to remember. But, we're just all struggling with this navigation, even though we're now several months into it and not knowing when it's going to end. So just to start, can you sort of paint a picture for me of your life just before this pandemic started? You were living in Oakland, and tell us what that looked like.
I was living in Oakland, California, and I had been there in the Bay Area for about 2 years, and was really coming to a stage, and I think this was also a part of turning 50, where I was in full what do I want from my life mode. And there was just a lot of transition, both in my career, in my job, where I was working, physically, emotionally, 50 staring me down the face, and just trying to figure out, what is it that I really want from myself. And prior to the pandemic, I had a very, very clear vision. I had come to the point where I was rooted in knowing exactly what it was that I needed for myself and what was going to be the right thing for me. And so, and that required me to make some very strong decisions about leaving my previous job, making up my mind that I was going to do that, deciding to leave the Bay Area, knowing where I wanted to go, which initially was supposed to be back to Chicago, but I'm in Florida. That's a whole other issue.
Right.
And putting the plans in motion to do so. And so by the time the pandemic had, hit in full effect, I was already in the midst of that process. I had left my company. I was in the process of interviewing for the position that I'm in right now. And I had left the Bay Area and was in Florida in the interim with the intention of going back to Chicago, but had to make a shift and be very agile. So I was in the midst of, prior to the pandemic, just a lot of thinking deeply and also strategically about what was going to be the right thing for my life.
Yeah, I think when you left Oakland, which, to be clear, you drove out of Oakland, right? Drove across country. Your mother and sisters, some family was in Florida, and you were sort of making a pit stop to see family, not knowing if you were going to get this job. So you left your job in biotech, you left your home in Oakland, really unsure to begin with of where you were going to land with any permanency. But in the temporary, you were headed to Florida to sort of visit family for a while and then see what happened. And then what happened was COVID-19.
Yeah.
And so very suddenly, you were sort of in this temporary mode, and now layered on top of that, there was this vast looming uncertainty in front of us. Yeah. And what I found really fascinating is that in the midst of all that, you have really planted some seeds, seeds that you had never planted before in your life. like home ownership, for example. So you mentioned Chicago. The job that you were interviewing for at the time was in Chicago. You're in Chicago. You're in Florida. You get the job that's in Chicago, right?
Boston, actually, the job was actually in Boston. So
Oh,
I
the
was
company's
always,
in
I was always
Boston.
going to be remote. I just wanted to live in Chicago. Yeah.
Okay, so the company's in Boston. You were planning to live in Chicago. Now it's COVID. You're in Florida.
Yes.
So then, what does your decision process look like? You're offered this job to start.
Mm-hmm.
What made you take the job, and what was your expectation for your life when you did?
So I took the job because it was work that I was just very interested, that I really wanted to do. When I speak about, it was actually, now I think about it, this is August, it was this time last year that I had made up my mind about the kind of work that I wanted to do. And the space that I was in, as wonderful as it was, I didn't see myself being able to do it. And so when I
talk in a more specific way, like what were you doing and what did you decide you wanted to pivot to?
So I was working for a large biotech company, which I won't name, that I had been at for about 11 and a half years. And I was working in advocacy relations, which is building partnerships with advocacy organizations, think like Susan B. Komen and American Cancer Society. So building partnerships with those organizations between industry and advocacy to identify and collaborate on meeting unmet needs for patients. And so I had found my sweet spot in doing that kind of work. However, I had a vast amount of experience in marketing and sales and leadership and all different types of things that I was looking for a place where I could take those skills and bring them all together and build something from the ground up. And so when I made the decision, it was a two-pronged decision to both leave my previous company, but also I was driven to leave the Bay Area, period, just personally. There was a personal component. So both of those had very equal weighting in what I felt was going to be the right thing for myself, which was to leave and then to look for work that was going to feed that opportunity to build something from the ground up. And so the organization that I'm at now is a startup in that sense. And so I'm still doing the same work, but I'm doing it as the head of a function and building it from the ground up and being able to pull in all of my previous skills and knowledge and leverage it within this very new, very different, startup environment. And on top of that, I get to do it from a place where I have family. And at this phase in my life, that was also incredibly important to me. And so even though I ended up not going back to Chicago, where I also have family and which is home, there's something different when you are living around your mom and your two sisters and you guys haven't lived in the same place since you were a kid. And you are doing it in the midst of massive social unrest. You're doing it in the midst of a global pandemic. There's something very comforting and very rooting in that. And so that's why I made the decision to stay here. And my company was okay with that because I was always going to be remote. So it kind of didn't really matter, where I was going to be.
So I'm curious about the job search part of it because you had determined your ideal landing place was going to be Chicago. Mm-hmm. And yet you were interviewing with this company based in Boston. So were you specifically looking for roles that were either in Chicago or that would be remote and allow you to live in Chicago?
Yes. And so when I first engaged in conversation with this organization, it was actually at the end of 2019. And at that time, they wanted someone who was willing to live in Boston. And I said, no, thank you. But just, that part of it, I was not willing to let up on. Again, that's where that personal piece came in, that if I was going to be truly happy and engaged, I needed to, at this stage in my life, to be where I needed to be just so I can be whole. And a couple months later, I was approached again, and they had changed their mindset that, you know, actually you don't have to be in Boston. And really because, you know, the pandemic hadn't hit at that time. And so with the kind of work that I do, it requires an extensive amount of travel normally. And so when you're constantly on the road, you know, where does home base need to be? However, I understood the importance of, you know, when you're working in a startup and you are getting to know people, there is something about being there, like to understand the culture, you're building a culture, all of that.
Right.
Yeah. And so the commitment that I made was, okay, you know, I'm willing to interview and go through this process. You're okay with me living in Boston. I'm okay with when I start spending a significant amount of time in Boston. But that will not be, you know, where I lay roots and, you know, buy a home or anything like that. And so that was an agreement. And then of course, when COVID hit and Florida came into play, I went back and asked, you know, would there be any issue? I don't know why, but would there be any issue? And they were like, no, it's fine, you know?
Yeah. Everybody's somewhere and nobody's in the office.
Yeah.
So you take this job, but for the first time in your life, and you've moved through a succession of roles, you're working from home entirely, you're working remotely entirely, forget spending any significant periods of time in Boston or traveling the way you normally would in a job like this. You're just starting in a brand new place without being able to have physical contact with the team that you're going to be working with and building. So how did that transition go, and where did you look to inform how you moved through that? You know, did you show up for work the way you do on a typical first day? Did you get all like together and like, what did you do?
I did this for you, not, this is not an average day, trust me. You know, I'll be honest, that transition is still happening. I have not mastered it. And where I find some semblance of comfort is that everybody that I work with is in the same boat. Because I was hired amongst probably a couple hundred people that were all hired and started remotely at the same time. So none of us had actually, you know, worked together and in the same space. So, so there's a certain level of comfort and camaraderie almost in that, because you're a lot more forgiving when someone's cat walks across the computer, or that 3-year-old busts in, you know, to their mom's office demanding, you know, to have like cookies right then. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
It's just, or if I just don't feel like turning my camera on because it's just not a camera day, it's like you have permission for that. So, so we're all still navigating it. I think the biggest challenge is because I am building relationships as part of my job externally and representing the organization, that touchy-feely, showing up in person at a conference, having dinner, shaking hands, sitting face to face, that part is challenging. But again, it's also challenging for the organizations that I'm working with. And so there's this like, how do we build a partnership? How do we work together in the face of that? Because there's going to be a new normal. We don't know exactly what it looks like yet. It's going to be a new normal to navigate.
Does it feel like something of an advantage that you weren't the only one starting remotely, or do you think it would have been more advantageous, or is more, for those who are entering new roles in a very established framework? I feel like you all are building everything from the ground up together in this very different space. And so I'm sure that fuels creativity and ideas in a way that never would have happened if you were sort of trying to you know, move into a more established structure. But how does it feel to you and your team? Do you feel like, wow, this is actually in some ways better than what the norm might have been for us? Or not?
Well, I can speak personally. I feel like it's better because because this is what I was craving this. And so while I did not anticipate doing it in the midst of a pandemic, there was always going to be this element of freedom to create and be innovative, because I was doing something, I was establishing something that wasn't quite yet formulated. There was someone in the role before me, but I'm now taking it to a bigger and a larger level. So So I think that is, you know, I think for everybody, there are certain things that you do miss about a structure, like having certain processes in place and, you know, procedures, and you kind of have like, you can measure a certain decision based off something that was done previously, but when you have nothing to go on, that can be a little bit, you have to have you gotta have some guts.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, but also a willingness to, which I think where I work, we've been really good about giving permission to make a mistake, and to say, you know what, my bad, that wasn't the right decision, which I'm completely comfortable with in my personal life.
Yeah.
So that transitions into this being a really good, ideal situation for me professionally.
Yeah. So by what was your first day on this job?
April 4th.
So by mid-April, tax day, you're in a new state, you're in a new job. And then you decide, maybe I'll buy a new house.
Mm-hmm.
So how did that all come about? Was buying a house, I know this is the first time you've owned a home, right? So
Yeah.
was this something that was part of your vision for My Life at 50? And you were thinking maybe you would buy in Chicago, but then it shifted, or how did that whole decision take shape?
So 100% a part of my vision for my life, even before 50. This is something, and it's a whole different conversation, but this is something from a personal level that I have wanted since I was a kid. And there was no way in heck that I was not going to own a home. Pandemic be damned, I was going to buy myself a house. And, you know, and there is something about being 50 that makes it like, you know, really, really significant.
Yeah.
And so when I was mentioning earlier about, you know, there was a strategy that I had put into place this time last year, that was a part of the strategy. You know, when I made the decision to leave my previous company, I didn't leave empty-handed, you know, and that made it so that I could actually, you know, buy my first home.
Yeah.
So that, you know, that was all a part of the planning. But I have to tell you, but I will say, you know, if I hadn't secured a job, obviously I wouldn't have bought the house.
Right.
But it was time to put down some roots, and that's just what I did.
And was it surprising kind of to you that you decided to do it in Florida? Were you thinking you were going to do it in Chicago? Like how did your plans sort of shift? You mentioned the word agility earlier, you know, and I think that is an enormous part of all of our capacity to move through this time. But how agile did you have to be to decide, okay, yeah, I've been wanting to do this, but I'm going to do this right here, right now, in the midst of a spiraling economy. And okay, I don't know, Florida was where I'm meant to be. You know, how did you have to adapt to get there?
Yeah, so it was surprising. It was surprising. So being in Florida has always been a part of my plan for retirement, which is I'm not near retirement yet, but that was always a part of my retirement plan because I wanted to be close to my family, my sisters, you know, and my mom in Florida. And going back to Chicago was more of a need to, because I was not happy in the Bay Area, that was a need to get back to the last place I was happiest, which was Chicago, which was with my friends, which was in the city that I love, you know, all of that. And so it was a little bit more of that. I had intended to buy a home in Chicago, had actually made at least one flight up in March to just take a look at some houses. But after being, I think I was actually walking around my sister's pool outside and just thinking. I had a tendency to just walk around it and think. And there was just an inspired moment that said, well, why not Florida right now? What is the reason why? Because it feels good. The sun is good. The family feeling is good. It's a lot less expensive. You know, why not? And I started exploring that why not a lot further. And I started talking to my family, you know, my sisters a lot more about it. And they were very excited about, yeah, you should do it. You should do it. And then I just started saying, well, maybe I'll just look at a couple of houses and just kind of see. Yeah. And I saw this house actually just online. I think it was on Redfin. And I was like, ooh, I like that one. And it was, and I saw it. And I asked a friend who was a real estate agent if she would take me out to see some homes just to see. And I said, but this one is the one that I really want to see. And this was the second one that we saw. And I was like, we're good.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it really was kind of a spontaneous decision. So what enables you to jump like that with certainty in such an uncertain time? Did you feel because you'd seen it online, like that was kind of a sign? What were sort of the factors that helped you commit?
I wish I could say that it was something so grand. It was just, I think I have cultivated an ability to just know my gut and my instinct very well now. And I don't necessarily, if whatever it is, house or job or whatever, feels like it fits all those needs, all those things that ladder up to that vision, that I have, then there's not a necessity to go see 25 homes or have 40 job interviews at different companies. I'm good, here. And so, that part of it, I think, is just a matter of something that I have just learned to listen to much more closely now and respect. And I was, it's funny when you brought this up to me about us having this conversation, it forced me to actually take a step back and really think about, what is my process? Because I think I had said to you at first, I was like, oh, life is an adventure. It's how I think about things, which there is that element. But I felt like, I'm shortchanging myself, because there is an actual strategy and a process to how I've thought through every decision. And it made me go way back and think about all the major decisions that I've had in my life and what is it, that drives it. So, whereas previously I might have been, I might have looked at 40 houses or done 30 different job interviews or what have you, because I wasn't quite sure and settled into what it is that I know is right for me. But now it's different. Now I have full autonomy over my life and every decision. And I give myself permission to change my mind at any point. And I give myself permission to make a mistake. And oops, and maybe even laugh about it, because I have enough wisdom at this point to look back 50 years and see where those decisions may have gone right or wrong, but I've always ended up being okay. I'm still here. And so that's why even when I think about looking forward, I'm still anchored to that knowledge of, I know regardless of what happens, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be okay. I don't know what it'll look like, but I'll be all right.
Yeah. And I think being able to tap into that at a time in the world where so much does not feel all right is really, really critical. And that piece, I'm just up for the adventure. Life is an adventure. I know you stepped into sort of the journey into your 51st year with some big trips and, Bali and doing things that you really had thought about doing for a long time. But I also know that you have always, always been very deliberate.
Yes.
So you can be game for the adventure. It doesn't mean you're just running toward the cliff and jumping off of it. You are very, very deliberate and intentional with how you go about things, which is why I really wanted to talk through this with you. So now it's spring, you've got new state, new job, new home that you own. So you have planted roots. Even though your daughter is still on the West Coast and your job is way, way north, you've sort of chosen, okay, this is where I am for now. And to some degree, this is where I'm going to be in one way or another for a long time. And you've mentioned now a few times turning 50. I know that you really felt 50 coming, and you were very intentional about your approach to that big birthday. And a lot of people have had, watershed moments during this time. And I think it's interesting to experience something like this, because you sort of had a vision for your birthday for the better part of a year, and then all of that just went to hell because nothing about it in that actual big final moment was what you expected.
Yeah.
So when that happens, right, when the whole apple cart is upset, how did it feel after all of your anticipating what turning 50 would actually look and feel like? What did it actually look and feel like?
It feels good. I don't know that I knew it. I don't know that I had a vision for it. I'll put it this way. I had an idea of what I knew I wanted to accomplish by 50, or things that I just wanted to kind of have in place. But actually, like that number 50, I didn't really have a lot of anxiety nor expectation around, other than I am the youngest of 7, and the next to me, my sister who is next to me is 7 years older than me. And so I've always grown up with women who are older and who have kind of set the stage for what it looks like to graduate into these next phases of life. And it isn't always pretty, but it also isn't all horrible, either. And so it was more so looking forward to getting to that place where I've seen all of my sisters go, where I've seen many of my friends that I just love, go. It was more of an excitement to kind of get there. But the other things were just kind of like practicalities, that I really wanted to have. I wanted to have a home by the time I was 50, just because I just was tired of moving, and then there's of course the financial benefits and everything else. But the other piece of turning it was like, and you brought up the decision about my birthday, when I decided to blow up the plans of having this big grand bash in Chicago, which I never wanted, but my dear girlfriend guilted me into it. That was a moment of, I am going to do things my way. I'm going to do what I want to do and what feels right for me. And this does not feel right. And so 48 hours before the party, I pulled the plug and sent an email out and said, everybody, thank you, but I've decided to celebrate my birthday in a different way. And I had 8 of my closest friends in an Airbnb in Chicago, and we had a cake from the grocery store and pizza and bourbon. And that was my 50th birthday, and I would do it any other way but that.
Yeah, I think, and I think that some of that also, like that moment of true agency and ownership of your life, right? Like, I'm not going to step into whatever this next phase is going to be or hold for me, expected or unexpected, in any way that smacks of anything inauthentic.
Yes.
I think it tends to be, I think, a very womanish perspective, because especially at these ages, 40, 50 and so on, where you are a little bit removed from so many of the things, obligations, for lack of a better word, that occupied so much of your time, space, and decision making, right? Whether that was motherhood, whether that was caregiving elders, whether that's partnering, and even the early years of your career, where you just feel so, beholden to whatever the pace is that's set for you.
Yeah.
As opposed to deciding, what? No, I'm not. I know that's the way they've done it. Yeah. I have to see a better way or a different way. I'm going to make them try it, right? You have the ability to sort of maneuver a little bit differently. But so, okay, new state, new job, new home, new era of your life. Yeah. And in the midst of all that, Stephanie, because I know that's just not enough, you decide that you are going to sort of embark on this new endeavor that is a bit of a passion project, but it really has to do with a new sort of personal movement in your life, potentially a new business. And so tell me a little bit about What the 50.
Yeah, What the 50. So What the 50 is intended to be, and it will be, it's going to start out as a website and a blog, where basically I'm creating a platform and an opportunity for women, and I'm very purposeful about Black women and women of color, but with a Black women's voice because I'm writing it, who are at this point either are very close to approaching at or having turned 50, to have conversations about what that means for us, from both whether it is career, whether it is but with a sense of humor, a high sense of thoughtfulness and intellect, like real conversations, and not only focusing on the things that we all talk about all the time, menopause and all those things that happen, which are real and are important, but I feel like have just become like almost the definition, like the only narrative that we hear about what it means to be 50 or close to 50. And I have such admiration for this transition, and not just my own life, but as I mentioned before, as I've watched other women before me, it's such a real, beautiful, funny, sometimes embarrassing, period that I want to celebrate that. And I want to talk about that. So What the 50 comes from those, WTF moments that you experience at this stage of life. And it's going to be an opportunity to talk about it. And I'm going to be looking to launch it in late September. Ideally by my birthday in October, but late September is when I'm looking to launch it. So I'm kind of pulling things together in the background right now. But writing, as you know, has been a passion of mine since I was very young. And I actually had every intention of being a journalist. I wanted to be Caroline at one time in my life.
But you went for the money, so good choice. Yeah. Trade-offs to everything.
Right. But no, but really that is something that has always been in me that I have never, lost sight of. And so, but I've always felt like, what story do I want to tell? And I have littered the internet with unfinished blogs, more than I care to say, because there's this period I've gone through these periods of, is that really what I talk about? Am I really rooted in that conversation? I went through my moment of social justice in 2016 and I'm writing and I had to Huffington Post things and all of that, but it's like, but is that what I only want to talk about? So now that I've achieved this stage in my life, I'm like, you know what, this is when I want to talk about it. And I want to talk about it from the perspective of being a Black woman. And I want to talk about it in the context of everything that's going on, in our lives and in the world right now and what that means, because it is a very different experience for us, socially, medically, in relationships, financially, all of it. And I just feel like we don't talk enough about this stage. We talk about retirement age and we talk about 30s, but we don't really talk about this as much in that context. And that's what I want to do.
We're in middle school again.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm just curious in terms of, you talked about your mother and your sisters and, maybe to some degree the unexpected benefits of being so near them. I know it's been years since you lived in close proximity to them. And this moment finds you all together, which that also happened over the course of years, right? All together in a very different place than where you all began, in Chicago. And so I'm curious, as we do move into some eventual new normal, where you have created a new normal for yourself within all of this uncertainty, and you approach this blog and this business, particularly with Black women in mind. What do you find yourself most concerned about for us as a collective, particularly given that you have your mom and your sisters there? who represent, a different generation to some degree, or a few different generations. Because all of us, no matter what vantage point we are at, we have daughters, who are launching in life now. We're all presented with a very different world, not just than our parents had, but than we expected to be in, frankly, and that our children expected to be in.
Yeah.
So, I feel like the middle is typically the balance point, right? It's typically sort of where you drop the anchor, is at that point where you can stabilize both sides. And I feel that as Black women, particularly at this stage of life, we are in that position, right? We're trying to help these kids launch. We're trying to help elders, have some peace and health. And we're at this point where, in a sense, all gates are open if we're lucky enough to explore things that we've been waiting to. So what are your concerns for what the new normal will look like for us? And what do you see as our role?
Wow, that's a big question. I think what I see as our role, and the way that I approach it for me, is I feel very responsible to the generation coming up behind me, specifically my daughter, who's almost 26 years old. And it's important for us to listen to them and create space for their concerns and their needs, because they are going to make decisions and will be responsible for taking care of us when we are older.
Yes, God help us.
Trying to be on their bad side. But seriously, because I've even had to check myself, and I've been checked by my daughter, and even my nieces and nephew about, we all have about, you guys really need to listen to us. We're coming up at a very different time than you are, just as I came up at a very different time than my parents did. And we need for you to, while you are looking for us to be the change and, move us forward in all these different capacities, recognize that there are burdens that are on our shoulders, that we weren't anticipating, with debt and the pandemic and racism. Well, that's not going away, but that's not new, rather. Right. But so I think as a collective, I think it's important. That's one thing that I think is really important for us to think about and be responsible to, is creating that space and the resources that we do have, utilizing them to help bring those young sisters and brothers coming up behind us along, and creating and empowering them with our voice to also break down and change some of these institutions that are making it more difficult, for the rest of us. When I think about some very specific things, I'm very concerned about our health. I think that, the statistics that are all out there about chronic disease and maternal death, and I have a master's in public health, obesity, all of those things are very real issues that impact not just our physical health, but our financial well-being, our ability to be full participants in every aspect of our society, as Americans, as humans, as people, as women, as Black people, so that for me is something that is of really utmost concern, is how do I engage in finding ways to shore up the health of our communities, mental and physical and social, so that's something, those are things that I think are really of key importance right now.
Yeah. What have you been doing during this time just to guard your own physical and emotional well-being?
That's a great question, because I just had this conversation with a dear friend of mine this morning. The Jacob Blake situations that happening. Jacob Blake, the father, who's also named Jacob Blake, and his brother, Justin Blake, I went to high school with, from the same town of Evanston. And you know, if anybody knows Evanston, it's a very tight-knit, you know, community on the North Shore of Chicago. And
just to be clear, we're talking about Jacob Blake, who was shot by police in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
Yes, yes. And I saw the alert pop up on my phone, and it just said, young Black man, Jacob Blake, shot in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And I immediately went to the Blake brothers that I knew in Evanston. Kenosha is very close to Evanston, so it wasn't unlikely that it could be. Long story short, you know, learning more about it, I learned that it was actually Jacob's son. And the trigger, you know, that emotional trigger, once again, that has become so exhausting, you know, for us, you know, immediately kicked in. And so how I have chosen to kind of, what I've told my friend this morning, to protect my peace, is I'm very methodical about how much I take in and from where of news and information and, you know, all of that. Not to be blinded or like, I don't want to see it, I don't want to hear it, but I think over the last several years, you know, we have all become so deeply entrenched and angered and in such anguish over everything that has been happening, and, you know, seeing these horrific incidents with these, you know, young unarmed Black men being killed by the police, that I don't want to be taken out of the fight, you know, because of that. I need to preserve my energy. And so that means limiting social media. That means being thoughtful about, I'm not going to watch that news today, but I might read it in the newspaper or another source, or quiet means. I've also stepped up my commitment to meditation. I have been a fierce practitioner daily of meditation for probably about between 3 and 4 years now. And I cannot tell you how much, at least having that to go to and anchor to in those moments where I need to just breathe and focus, and I've trained myself to be able to do so, that has had a huge benefit. But I will tell you, it's tough. I mean, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but it's really, really difficult to kind of protect your peace. But it's a necessity in order to be in this for the long haul.
Well, I can tell you, I think that, you know, your journey over these last several months has been a huge uplift to watch from a distance, because, you know, I think, Stephanie, it's a reminder that even in the midst of things that we can't control, there's a lot that we can, and we don't always see the forest for the trees. It takes guts, as you said earlier, to sort of recognize that and go ahead and take control of those things in a moment where things feel so chaotic and overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
But I would be interested to know, when you do that, right? Recognizing that you have sort of harnessed the ability and the courage to be optimistic and move forward with your vision for your life, even though so many things potentially are beyond your control and things you couldn't see. How does it feel? Has your ability to make these decisions in real time with everything in flux impacted your sort of fundamental wellness, similarly to how you say, you know, your meditation practice has? Like, how has it felt to be able to lock these things in a moment where everything is so jittery?
You know, I'll be honest with you. There have been, so it has felt good. But what I have wrestled with is feeling guilty for that. You know, in the midst of everything that has been going on in this world, and in America, and in my community, I have had those moments of, well, why am I able to still do these things, and why me? And you know, should I just kind of like shrink away from really embracing, you know, the fullness and of what it is that I've been able to do in the midst of it. And so, you know, I've actually had conversations, you know, with people about wrestling, you know, with that. And what I have come to learn and to accept is that, you know, in the midst of so much strife, I mean, you can go down the list of what's happening right now. There is still space for goodness. There's still space for the fact that prior to all of this, I had been putting in the work. This had always been a part of what I've seen and wanted and desired and, you know, worked and made all my moves for, you know, over the course of my life. You know, there is still space for grace, you know, if you will. And so, and there always will be. And so I think that's the thing that has helped me to navigate not feeling guilty or as in some way that this should not be me. No, it should be, because this process is bigger than me. It's bigger than this pandemic, and it's been in play for well before and will be well beyond, you know, all of this happening. And so that's really what I anchor to, you know, now.
I love that. There's always space for grace, spoken like a truly wise 50-year-old woman. And you know, and I have to say too, for the record, like, it can be tempting, especially in our community, especially at this time, but it never serves any of us individually or collectively to shrink in any way. Like, we just cannot afford that. We can't afford to shrink from opportunity. We can't afford to shrink from inspiration. And we certainly can't afford to shrink from grace. So right. I'm happy for you. Congratulations on all of the newness that you have in your life. I look forward to seeing what happens with the business. To everyone else, thanks for joining us. Stay safe and stay well.